R. Ford Presidential Library Museum for just over 7 years now. But for about 2 decades, we have been a proud partner of the World Affairs of West Michigan. And we are very happy for the very first time ever in our history to host the Greatest Decisions, a series of lectures here in our great auditorium. That's all I have to say. As well, please welcome on behalf of the Archivist of the United States and the National Archives to our facility. And now I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, Gleaves Whitney.
Well, welcome. I want to add to what Joel just said, a hearty welcome to you from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. You know, we're about partnerships here in this town. One of the things West Michigan does so beautifully are partnerships to pull off great programs for the public. You know, when I was first approached about whether this would be a good partnership to work with, Joel and I work together all the time because he's the Ford Archives and Museum, and we're the Ford Foundation. But when Michael Van Dennen, think about President Ford. What would President Ford want? President Ford was so in tune with international affairs, made it a priority to study up on it when he was in the presidency. So this was a marriage that had to happen. And in fact, in describing a partnership such as ours, or one we have with Joel, where you double the joys and have the burdens of life. And so that's the way we look at this partnership. We're so proud to be part of the Great Decisions program, and we want to keep a good thing going. We got a lot of good people who are going to be coming up, and especially our speaker from Ann Arbor.
Michael Van Dennen, I'm the Executive Director of the Council, and on behalf of my colleagues Erica Kubik, Rachel Brooks, and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, thank you for coming, those here and those online, and thank you for being globally curious. The mission of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan is to engage the people of our community in world issues and to help them think about these things thoughtfully and carefully. To change the world, we believe one must first know the world. That's what we're about, and you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Thanks so much to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and to Wolverine Worldwide for being significant partners to this. Thanks to the folks in the booth from GRCC and from the Ford Museum for helping us broadcast this worldwide. I also want to thank our media sponsors, and that is the Community Media Center here in Grand Rapids and WGVU Media Services right here in Grand Rapids. Thank you. We caught him on his way from Chicago to Ann Arbor, and that he will give us some insight into Indonesia. We're really looking forward to that. After his presentation, there'll be ample time for questions. And please get ready for that. You can text them. Those of you online can put them in the YouTube channel, chat box. And as always, our house rules, be respectful to our speaker and others by asking respectful and succinct questions. That's always good. And now, Joanna Bohr, who is a member of the World Affairs Council Board of Directors, and she is an advisor to the chairman at Calvin University, and she just got back from Indonesia. She will introduce her speaker, Joanna.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a privilege to be here tonight. I indeed just got back from Indonesia on Monday, so yesterday, actually. I was there for a very fascinating time, and I was there for Chinese New Year with my husband, as well as the election on Wednesday. So it was, yeah, I'm particularly interested in this topic tonight. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Dan Slater, the James Orrin Murfin Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center of Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. Dr. Slater specializes in the politics and history of dictatorship and democracy with a regional focus on Southeast Asia. He came to Michigan in 2017 after 12 years on the faculty at the University of Chicago, where he served as director of the Center for International Social Science Research and professor in the departments of political science and sociology. His book, examining how divergent historical patterns of contentious politics have shaped variation in state power and authoritarian durability in 7 Southeast Asian countries, titled Ordering Power, Contentious Politics and Authoritarian Leviathans in Southeast Asia, was published in the Cambridge Studies in Comparative Politics series in 2010. His latest book, titled From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia, from Princeton University Press in 2022, explores why rapid economic development has led to democratization in some Asian countries, but not others. Dr. Slater's published articles can be found in many disciplinary journals. He received a BA in International Relations and History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an MA in International Studies from the University of Washington, and his PhD from Emory University in 2005. He spent 10 months as a Fulbright scholar in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in 1998. Beyond Southeast Asia, he has done international consulting work on challenges related to democratization and demilitarization in cases such as Ethiopia, Fiji, and Pakistan. He also has recently worked as a consultant and non-resident fellow with international policy organizations such as the American Enterprise Institute, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Freedom House, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the World Bank. His presentation tonight is titled Indonesia's Dangerous Transition. Let's welcome Dr. Dan Slater.
Well, thank everyone so much for coming out tonight. Thanks so much for the generous introduction. Not as succinct as it could have been, so we're asking for succinct questions. I guess we should have had a more succinct introduction. But it's really great to see so many people. Elections that took place last week that we'll be talking about, and I really look forward to your questions. Thanks also to Erica Kubik and everybody here who's made this such a nice smooth journey to come in and to be able to do this at a convenient time for everyone involved. So really looking forward to having this conversation. So as mentioned, the talk is on Indonesia's dangerous transition. You note that I didn't call it Indonesia's dangerous election. So why not a dangerous election? Well, in part because elections in Indonesia aren't typically moments of a lot of conflict or electoral fraud or of social instability. For 25 years now, democratic elections have been bringing more stability, more predictability to the rhythms of Indonesian politics than the authoritarian military-led government that preceded it. So in a broad sense, democracy has been doing for the past 25 years what it's supposed to do, which is reduce conflict, give people an alternative way of deciding who will be in power and how decisions will be made about who will be in power. So it's been, broadly speaking, a successful experiment. And I often like to say Indonesia has been the world's biggest democratic experiment of the last 50 years. Not since India became a democracy in 1947 has any country of Indonesia's scale become a democracy. It is the world's largest Muslim population, the world's largest country with a Muslim majority. It's the 4th largest population in the world, 273 million people. And it's also the world's, often called the world's third largest democracy. Although, depending on what you think what's happening in Indonesia, what you think is happening in India, and what's happening in the United States, we might change how we think about those rankings. But so the transition here, so I do want to make the case there is danger in this transition moment, but it's not in the election process itself, but it's really in the process of what follows. And that in general, it's often the case in Indonesia, the bigger questions get settled after an election takes place rather than the election itself. So another way to think about what I'll be talking about today is that this is what I'm calling a high-stakes handover. There's a handover happening from the current incumbent president, Joko Widodo, who is uniformly known as Jokowi, and there is a handover ongoing to Prabowo Subianto, just known as Prabowo. Usually in Indonesian, you just use the first name and just refer to by one name. So from Jokowi to Prabowo. So why do I call this a handover? Well, as you might have seen, there's been essentially has basically anointed and soft endorsed Prabowo Subianto as his successor. So I think this picture kind of captures pretty well a lot of the dynamics of recent moments in Indonesia. That you have this chummy kind of bromance between former rivals, between the outgoing and incoming president, and you kind of see the sort of adoring public looking on who are sort of casting a vote in favor of this handover of power that is taking place. I should also note that as part of this process, some constitutional legerdemain, shall we say, some skullduggery, has allowed Jokowi, the current president, his son is the vice president-elect. To be on a presidential ticket, but thanks in part to the fact that Jokowi's brother-in-law was the head of Indonesia's High Court, a decision was made that Gibran, who is Jokowi's son, could run as Prabowo's running mate. So we'll talk about that a bit more. But this was a very troubling maneuver and is one of the reasons why this election has raised a lot of concerns about democratic health in Indonesia. So why do I say this is so here's the handover part. So why do I say it's high stakes? Here what I really want to sort of persuade you of today, and I think in contrast to what you will read if you're reading about the Indonesian elections, is that Indonesia is a democracy with a lot of very, very strong on the one hand, Indonesian democracy has so many flaws and is so problematic that it's not even really worth defending, as opposed to those who say Indonesian democracy is basically doing fine. This is a vote for continuity, so we shouldn't be too concerned. I want to argue against both a kind of complacent and also a defeatist view of Indonesian democracy. And I want to try to put two very different ideas in your head, in a sense, right? One being that democracy has all of these strengths in Indonesia, but that is also very much in real danger, okay? So from one perspective, some people say Indonesian democracy is basically fine. Others say that it has already failed. I'm going to disagree with both of those viewpoints. So what I'd like to persuade you of this evening is that democracy can be both very much worth defending on the one hand, but also in real trouble on the other hand. So what I want to do is start by sort of assessing and detailing the lingering strengths of Indonesian democracy, despite the fact that it has, without question, been experiencing democratic erosion or democratic backsliding over the past few years. And the way I'm going to do this is by just showing you some charts that speak to Indonesia's overall democratic quality compared to the most natural countries to compare it to in the world. So Indonesia is really three main things. It's a very large country, it is a Muslim majority country, and it is a Southeast Asian country. So how does Indonesian democracy fare compared to other countries in those categories? So let's start with large countries. And so in this chart, Indonesia is the purple composite index of all the democratic features of different countries, okay? So what this should suggest that same line. The color will change, but hopefully you'll recognize the slope. So if we compare Indonesia to other Muslim majority countries, on a track to becoming the strongest democracy in the Muslim world. We have the transition in 1998 when the old authoritarian regime fell, and they have really maintained to a strong degree the democratic qualities of the past 25 years. And you contrast that with, say, a case like Tunisia, which is the blue line. Tunisia, of course, during the Arab Spring had this collapsed into sort of one-man rule again. So we see Indonesia now is, again, kind of holding the line as among these major Muslim majority countries, so Egypt, Malaysia, Pakistan, Tunisia. Turkey, again, historically used to be the orange line. Looks a lot like India, right? So a place which was sort of one of the, people thought of, Turkey as maybe the most democratic place in the Islamic world. There's been real democratic erosion under Erdogan there. So again, not to say Indonesian democracy is perfect in any way. I've written elsewhere that it's not a model, but it is an example. And what it is an example of is a relatively robust, high-quality democracy. And then if we think about Southeast Asian countries, again, not a deeply democratic region, but here too, now Indonesia, the line is turned to green, but again, the same slope. And you see here that compared to certainly a place like Myanmar, which where recently very, very brutal coup and civil war, the military taking power again. Thailand as well, a place where the military continues to keep a strong foot in politics. On the prior chart, Pakistan, you might have been aware of the recent elections in Pakistan, where again, the military is very, very hesitant to see its primacy in politics fade. This is very different from in Indonesia, where elections really do put people in power, and the military does really respect the results of elections. So here too, you see that in Southeast Asia, a region of really vital geopolitical importance, as we can talk about, Indonesia is kind of the standard bearer for the region. So hopefully this gives you a sense that, a lot is at stake. And this is a place with really meaningful democratic quality to be defended. So not everybody loves images of data. So what about images from the campaign and from the election? I think some of these images will give you a flavor, give you a sense of what elections look like in Indonesia, and particularly this one. So I love this picture. You see the motorcycles on the street. You see this is a really kind of a great classic photo of an Indonesian urban street during an election campaign. And what do we see? Well, we see there are lots of parties. There are lots of candidates. And they're saying kind of, positive things. So we see over here on the side here. So do you want a pair that is ready to work, right? This is the kind of like a pair that's really ready to do the people's work. We have a poster next to it saying that when the women of Indonesia move ahead, the people of Indonesia move ahead. Our Prabowo Gibran, our eventual winners, they're saying basically, let's go. Lanjutkan, let's go. We have a more religiously themed poster next to that from the political party, which is usually seen as the most secular party in Indonesia. So what we have is this kind of range of, a wide range of political parties. There's real choice. There's real competition among political parties for the people's vote. And here is I think another really great photo to give you a sense of the feel of Indonesian elections. There's a reason why Indonesians call elections festivals of democracy. So here, again, what do we see? We see all kinds of political parties all at the same rally, all kind of coming together to kind of back up the political party that they wanted to see win in this week's past elections. This is in the National Stadium in Jakarta. This is also an unbelievably enormous organizational achievement. Indonesia is a vast archipelago, again, over 200 million registered voters. And so merely holding an election all on one day across this vast, diverse archipelago is a colossal undertaking, and in its own right, a really massive achievement. So here, these are boxes, so the KPU is the Indonesian Election Commission. So you can get a sense of the paper involved. You get a sense of the lift it takes to actually even do this. And the fact that Indonesian elections come off without really much concern about fraud, much concern about violence, much concern about manipulation. This election, there is more concern that Jokowi, as an incumbent president, used the resources of the state more to support Prabowo than has been the case in the past. So I don't want to say that this is a perfectly level playing field, but certainly the will of the Indonesian people was very clearly done in this election. As you can see, tabulating that is no mean feat. And so the upshot I kind of want to leave you with is that Indonesian elections are still very vibrant affairs. They're still contested. They are very expressive of people's popular will and their desire to participate in politics. And they're quite upbeat, actually, as well. These are not grim, dark, the world is ending sorts of elections. So I think this, again, kind of captures the spirit. So even 25 years after regaining their democratic rights, there is still a real sense of joy that tends to accompany the electoral exercise in Indonesia. Okay. So let me give you just a quick sense of the results and some main points with that. So the rule in Indonesia was so there were three candidates, and you have to get 50% on the first round to avoid a runoff. So February 14th was the first round, and only if somebody got 50% would that avoid a runoff in June. So by virtue of winning 58% of the votes, Prabowo Subianto and Gibran, again, Jokowi, the incumbent president's son, got about 58% of the vote. Also, I should say, Indonesian polling and these kind of quick count and these exit polling results they get are incredibly sophisticated. Lots of actually American-trained political scientists and pollsters in Indonesia who, with remarkable precision, can give you a really good sense of how people are going to vote and how they voted coming out of the poll. So even though they'll be literally counting those boxes of paper for months, we can be really quite confident that these results are for real. So we see this is quite an impressive result, right? Prabowo and Gibran get 58% of the vote. And one reason I wanted to put these pictures up here was to just give you a sense of what Gibran is like. Okay, so one thing I've been asked recently is, okay, well, so Gibran, again, he's the son of the president. The president has sort of put him in this place. Is he going to be the real power behind the throne? Is this really going to be something where Prabowo is taking his orders from Gibran? Okay, and these two pictures to me, this does not look like someone who's going to be bossing around an old retired general with a record of human rights abuses, right? He looks like a kid. Right? Does this look like a vice president of a country? Gibran is totally not ready for prime time. And I should say the vice presidency in Indonesia is a very weak office to begin with. It is usually not a real stepping stone to the presidency. So I just want to give you a sense here of someone who's sort of out of his depth. And if you think, well, maybe this will really be Jokowi's third term because his son is vice president, this should give you a sense of why I don't think this is the case. So, sometimes pictures can tell you a lot. So Prabowo won this big result, and the only thing else I want to just sort of signal at the outset, we can talk about all of this, I would love to talk about all of these details ad nauseum in the Q&A. But one thing just to note, so the ticket of Ganjar Pranowo, who's the governor of Central Java, and his running mate, they fared quite poorly. Only gained about 17% of the vote. This was a pretty big surprise as of a year ago. About a year ago, people thought Ganjar was going to win. Ganjar is the closest thing to a Jokowi clone that exists. And just to give you a sense, Jokowi he has a really great common touch. And he's kind of obsessed with economic development and with poverty. So Jokowi's days are sort of spent, he gets out into the streets and he'll wade into flood zones and he'll just sort of go, and he wants to know what people need, and he's very, very attentive to sort of what ordinary, especially poor Indonesians want. And Ganjar seemed like he was the prototype, and he would be able to follow in this model. But what in fact happened was, when Jokowi, the incumbent, when he threw his weight behind Prabowo, it really tipped things in a dramatic way. And what it really shows you is Jokowi himself, the current incumbent president himself, is so popular, his coattails were so long that he was able to sort of bring and help carry Prabowo into the presidency, even though Prabowo, again, has a very, very checkered track record. And he had lost in 3 consecutive national elections. 2009, he was the vice presidential candidate, lost. 2014, he ran against Jokowi, lost. 2019, he ran against Jokowi, lost even worse. But this time he wins, in part because of name recognition, in part because just through sheer force of staying power, but also the role of Jokowi's endorsement and support in bringing Prabowo to the presidency cannot be understated. And even though the political party which backed Jokowi, and then also was the party that nominated Ganjar, again, that early frontrunner, they still got the most votes in the parliamentary election. So there's a way in which there's a disconnect between the parties people support and the presidential candidates they support. There's not a way in which political parties simply can get people to vote for whoever they want to vote for. People are they're voting for who they want to vote for, not who their parties tell them to vote for. Okay, so let me try to just sort of list here a bit. So what are these lingering democratic strengths that I was trying to give you a sense of? So that data we saw before, those charts we saw, what were they telling us? So here, let me give you, it's a little bit of a long list, but I want you to understand that it is a long list. There is a lot to be happy about in Indonesian democracy. So this was the 6th peaceful democratic election in Indonesia since 1999. It's the 5th peaceful transfer of presidential power. There's no question this transfer will be peaceful. There is no question at all. Okay, this is why it's not in the news. This is why you're not seeing news stories about it. This will be a very, very smooth transition, yet again, okay? Presidential term limits, so there's a 2-term limit. And they have been respected. For a time, it looked like Jokowi might try to wiggle his way out of that and get a 3rd term, but ultimately a sense of a lack of public support for that. Even though Jokowi is popular, people did not want to see term limits thrown out. And this is very often how democracy begins eroding, is presidents will, I'm very popular, why should there be term limits? Let's get rid of term limits. And that tends to be a slippery slope into really undermining democracy. So although they were tested, they held. Presidential term limits are still in place. I should also note that, so Indonesia is an incredibly diverse country, ethnically or religiously, and ethno-religious minorities are much less often being targeted and scapegoated now than in the past. So democracy has not been bad for diversity. It's been all in all more good than bad for diversity. Lots of nuance, lots of wrinkles we can talk about, but that's, I think, the broad story. The kind of separatist movements that were chronic around the country when the Suharto regime fell in the late 90s, those have generally been tamed, generally peacefully managed. If you're aware of places like Aceh, where there was quite a civil war, that's gone away. There still is separatist unrest, and there are still human rights abuses in Papua, but again, much less so than in the past, I would say. As I noted, voters show substantial independence from party directives and endorsements. So people are not just being kind of dragged by the nose to the polls and being forced to vote for people they don't favor. Again, there was maybe somewhat more muscle behind the president this time around. And I should note, it's not that there's no money politics. So people will actually get paid. So they'll get relatively small amounts of money from political parties to go and vote. But they vote for who they want to anyway. So they'll accept handouts and say, well, this will be helpful for me to pay my utility bills or whatever else that I need to do, some meals for my family. But voters are really quite independent. And in interesting ways, when a politician gives money to a voter in Indonesia, it's more the voter extracting the money from the politician than the politician buying the voter, in a sense. It's not actually conveying the politician's power over the voter in the way we might think. Again, I think there are exceptions, but that's, I think, the broader story. Also, Indonesia, it's been under attack, but Indonesia has had one of the most powerful anti-corruption commissions in the world in the last 20 years. Totally remarkable that they were able to develop an institution like this in a place with such a history of chronic corruption. And its independence has been weakened under Jokowi, but again, it still exists, it is still there, it is not simply finished. So again, limping along like so much in Indonesian democracy. Indonesia also has a really robust culture of youth-led protest. Young people in Indonesia feel responsible for saving the nation from colonialism. And so when a national crisis arises, young people get out in the streets. They see it as their national mission to defend Indonesian democracy. This grounded back again, the old revolutionary tradition from the 1940s. But this is a really deep part of Indonesian political culture worth noting. Also, Indonesia has a very strong sense of its own sovereignty. It's a multi-ethnic nation, and it pursues a pretty independent foreign policy. So whereas it's often the case that people will try to dismiss democracies around the world as being, well, you're just an American puppet state, you're just a democracy because America made you that way, or because you're trying to please the Americans. Indonesia is a democracy because the Indonesian people fought for democracy. It is not to impress the United States. And in fact, as I'm sure anyone in the US government who has dealt with Indonesia will tell you, Indonesian foreign policy is not built around making America happy. So it is a very independent country, and in that respect, I think, suggests something more universal about democracy and its prospects around the world. Indonesia has also had very impressive economic development track record. It's done very well under Jokowi. You might have heard, a lot of the natural resources that Indonesia possesses are really going to be critical for green transition, electrification transition with automobiles, things like that. And again, democracy, people often say, well, democracy is dangerous because it's going to undermine, economic growth and development. That's not been the case in Indonesia. And also, as I noted earlier, the military in Indonesia, although historically a very, very powerful actor, it has shown no signs of directly intervening in civilian politics and electoral politics. That doesn't mean the military is irrelevant. They are important. They're about to get more important, I think, with Prabowo in the presidency, which is one of the problems. But it is not a case like Pakistan or like Thailand, where an election happens and then you think, okay, the people have voted, will the military accept the result? Or Myanmar, most tragically, right? In Indonesia, there's no question the military is going to accept the result. And they would have accepted the result no matter which of these candidates had won. I think there's no question about that. So these are all really important lingering strengths. So this is the high quality. Okay, but this is not to urge complacency, quite the opposite. The point I want to convey to you is that all of this high quality is confronting very high danger at this moment. So in what ways? Well, it's not enough to say, as people often say, well, Prabowo was sort of an alleged human rights offender, and he has his roots in the old Suharto regime, and it really doesn't do justice to just what a bad actor Prabowo has been historically. Okay, during the last decade of the military regime in Indonesia, the regime turned in a very nasty way against democratic opponents, against ethnic and religious minorities. You might have heard about campaigns of violence against ethnic Chinese minorities, for instance, right? These atrocities that were committed in the state of East Timor, in the province of East Timor. Prabowo's footprints, handprints were all over all of these things. The kidnapping of democracy activists in 1998, 13 of whom still remain unaccounted for. Again, this is not just alleged. Prabowo was at the head of all of these military operations. Okay, so he's not just lots of people in Indonesia have their roots in the old authoritarian system. There was a lot of continuity. Prabowo is a different level. He's a different kind of creature, all right? It's not only that. Much more recently, in the 2014 and the 2019 campaigns, he has worked very closely with some of the most intolerant Islamist groups in Indonesian civil society, and led to a bout of pretty serious polarization and a lot of concern about ethnic conflict from around 2016 to 2018. He also is a denier of electoral integrity. So in both 2014 and 2019, he lost substantially. These were not very close elections, but in both cases, he insisted that he had won. He insisted the elections were fraudulent. He insisted that again, he was obviously the real winner. And in 2019, this led to riots, and people died. There were deaths in the riots that resulted from, again, Prabowo stirring up this idea that he was the true election winner when he was clearly, patently not the election winner. Okay, so again, this is a deeply problematic sign for someone's democratic commitments. If you don't accept the results of elections, it's sort of problematic to be participating in elections, right? Just leave that for a moment. Also, so Prabowo has been one of the leading voices for a long time in calling for the elimination of direct democratic elections at every level of government. So just brief background on this, okay? So before 2004, there were no direct executive elections. You would choose your political party, right, in a parliamentary election, and then parliaments would choose the president, kind of like a prime minister, but it was an actual presidency, or your mayor, or your governor. So they would be chosen by parliament, not by the voters, okay? Prabowo has been at the forefront of moves to try to restore that situation. So basically, Indonesian voters are just showing too much independence. They've too much of a mind of their own, and this democracy thing's gotten a little out of hand. So let's maybe try to roll this back so that elite party politicians can choose mayors, governors, and presidents rather than the voters. I'm very concerned this could be one of the first things to go during a Prabowo presidency, because there's a lot of, I think he'd have a lot of support for him doing that. Prabowo has also promised to kind of rejuvenate and build up these territorial commands. So as a legacy of Indonesia's revolution against the Japanese and then against the Dutch, the Indonesian military ended up with these territorial commands throughout the archipelago, okay? And they then became associated with a lot of human rights abuses, a lot of corruption, a lot of abuse of power during the Suharto regime from 1966 to 98. They still exist, but they don't really matter that much anymore. Prabowo has insisted that these kodams, these territorial commands, should have a lot more power and a lot more resources and a lot more authority. So the worry is that the military is going to come back and play this much more of a muscular role in national politics, not by overturning elections, but at the local level. Another high danger here is the fact that this problem of dynasticism. Indonesia, much less so than the Philippines. If any of you are familiar with the Philippines is a real history of dynastic politics, very strong political families, you know, fathers, sons, daughters, sons, fathers, mothers in office. Indonesia has had, there's a lot of it at the local level, but not the national level. So the fact that Jokowi sort of intervened and helped his son become vice president despite his youthful age is sort of that's a kind of worrisome departure. So, and the fact that, again, these are kind of linked, this personalization of judicial politics. So again, the president's brother-in-law being the high court judge who allowed Gibran to become vice president. And I should say, this is one of these kind of interesting paradoxes. An ethics commission found this high court judge guilty of ethical lapses by making this exception so that Gibran could become vice president. And so he was removed from his position as the head of the high court, but the decision still stood. So there's a way in which, it's an interesting way in which the ethical lapse was actually punished by a real institution, but it didn't change the outcome. So you kind of can sort of just absorb that as sort of an interesting moment. Probably the most important way that democracy has eroded in Indonesia over the past 5 years is through the growing criminalization of protest. And criminalization of dissent. So you're just much more likely to run afoul of government authorities if you express alternative views, if you critique the government, if you criticize anything that's going on. And again, Indonesian democracy absolutely hinges on the robustness of, the energy of civil society and of protest and of dissent. Because again, elite party politicians in Indonesia just kind of do their own thing. They're not going to be very responsive unless society makes them be. Prabowo has even less temperament or, or willingness to deal with dissent and criticism. Again, he's this creature of the military, and he is again pulled from the playbook of people like Modi and Erdogan by saying, sort of dismissing all civil society as being foreign funded, foreign motivated, these foreign operatives, traitors among us. I don't expect him to become less like that now that he is an elected president. Also, it's very likely that Prabowo will face no opposition whatsoever. It is commonly the case in Indonesia that competitive elections are held, but after they are held, the winner just invites the losers into government, and therefore there's no political opposition. So the ultimate example of this was in 2019, when Jokowi, having defeated Prabowo twice, and Prabowo saying, "You stole the election from me, you're a fraud," Jokowi nevertheless said, "Prabowo, be my defense minister." and brought him into government in that way. And that lessened polarization, but it also meant it took some of the oppositional character out of politics. And so even though voters had rejected Prabowo over and over, and they've rejected other people over and over, they keep getting plum positions in government because the winners keep bringing them into government. So if Prabowo, against someone with the track record he has, if he faces no opposition, is he just going to be someone like Jokowi, who he focused everything on economic development and let democracy backslide? He wasn't sort of trying to destroy democracy, but he also wasn't trying to defend it. Prabowo could be like that. He could also be a lot worse. So how much will he feel constrained by the coalition that he has? Some are optimistic. I'm relatively, well, it doesn't really matter if I'm optimistic or pessimistic. What matters is that I'm concerned, and I think there's good reason to be concerned. Okay, so let me try to wrap up with some more general concluding thoughts. So not specific to Indonesia, but some things about democracy that Indonesia raises in our minds that we could think about. So those of you interested in other places might think about whether these are germane. So one, it's important to note that democracy can erode not just through the expression of polarization, but also through the suppression of polarization. And what I mean by that is, so in 2014 and 2019, it looked as if Prabowo could win as the sort of spokesperson for the Islamic majority against minorities, and this echoes what we see in a lot of places around the world where populists are sort of claiming the majority ethnicity, the majority race, the majority religion we're the real people, the minorities are not the real people, so let's rule in the name of the majority, right? And that's very, very dangerous. In Indonesia, that's been tamped down. And so you saw those posters. People weren't making appeals to, or sort of, they weren't attacking anybody in the campaign, right? But when there are efforts to suppress polarization and suppress difference of opinion, and when all political parties run sort of very similar campaigns, you can end up in a situation where there's not a lot of democratic diversity because there's not enough polarization. You need some disagreement, some sense of opposition to make democracy flourish. So it could be a different story in Indonesia, which we could talk more about. A second point I would make, a general point, we have this tendency to think of like honeymoon periods, right? There's an election, someone's won a landslide. I think Prabowo, it's safe to say, just won a landslide. That these are moments we should give them a lot of leeway. So these are moments when we as a society should step back, let the president have their free run of things because they've just gotten this big vote of confidence, and let's all step back. I think we have to fundamentally rethink that. Elected presidents have proven capable of such abuses of power in so many democracies around the world that these are actually really dangerous moments. And moments when people who have autocratic personalities or narcissistic streaks who become president, when they win, they become more dangerous because they feel they have been sanctified by a majority and that they truly speak for the people. So rather than thinking about a world where elections are when we have a mandate to leaders and therefore we should all kind of step back and give them more room to maneuver, I think it's when we have to be most cautious and most on our guard against the decline of democracy. Another point, kind of a global point, so everyone I think knows that we're in this era of global democratic erosion. So democracies are weakening around the world, but I would note that this is not mostly about elections. Elections keep spreading around the world. Elections, free and fair elections, keep spreading around the world. There are more free and fair elections in more parts of the world today than there have ever been before. Okay? So in that sense, democracy is still on the front foot, still on the march. Where democracy is declining and eroding is in the protection of civil rights. Okay? So the common pattern is a president, a prime minister, they win a free and fair election, and then they use that as their, again, the imprimatur they need, as the sanction they need to then go after minorities, go after opposition, go after dissidents, and the like. Okay, so in this sense, Indonesia fits the global pattern. Elections are still proceeding with a lot of quality. The real issue is not the election. The issue is what do elected officials do with their power. And we've learned over the last 10 years, even in a democratic election, people can do a lot more damage than maybe we thought they could do 10 years ago. Another point I would make, the role that militaries play in democracies deserves more attention than we tend to give, even when they're playing a low-profile role. So Indonesia's military is playing a very low-profile role. It's not like Pakistan, not like Myanmar, not like Thailand. They are not going to seize power, but they are playing this bigger role in politics that we should be watching for. Also, again, an enduring point about Indonesia, we kind of think if you have a democratic election, that will naturally produce a democratic opposition. That is not necessarily true. Politicians have to make an active decision to go into opposition. Like, will you actually say no to the temptations of sharing government office and be willing to serve as a principled opposition to hold government accountable? And one of the biggest issues in the next few months is, will the largest political party in Indonesia, will it join the government, or will it actually try to serve as some kind of opposition to Prabowo? So watch this space and watch for that. And a final point I would just make is that India, Turkey, arguably the United States as well, some of the most inspiring democratic examples across the world have been losing their shine in recent years. And I don't think we really know entirely what the effects of that will be. How much the democratic struggles we see in places that clearly lack democratic rights in this day and age. When you lose some of these examples, is that going to have a knock-on effect? Something where, again, Indonesia, when the world's third largest democracy suffers erosion, what are the effects on people pushing for democracy and trying to defend democracy in other parts of the world? So I'll end my remarks there and look forward to your questions. Thanks again so much for coming out and listening.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate that very much. You can text a question to 616-308-6560 if you would like to, or you can raise your hand. We'll take care of that. Erica will be checking on our remote listeners and letting us know if they've got a question.
Hands over here. And wait for the microphone so that our audience everybody can hear your question. I was informed of that.
I fear any question I ask is going to have hidden meanings or double meanings, but since this Prabowo fellow seems to be a little bit dodgy, why do you think he won by such a large margin?
Yeah.
Why did they vote for him?
Right. So I think there's a few stories here. So one thing I would say is, a growing conclusion I have about politics in general, about elections in general, not Indonesia specific, but if you can just be the candidate who can prove and act like they're the alpha male, that's going to get you 35 to 40% of the vote. Enough people are just drawn to power. Like, you just want the more powerful leader, whoever's more powerful. It's almost like, who wants to watch an action movie rather than the rom-com, right? You just want, and I do think the lines between politics and entertainment are so blurred now that in a sense, it is that kind of, this is the program I want to watch for the next 5 years. And there was very little differentiation in what people were calling for, like what kind of campaign appeals were being made. So he got up to about 45% in the two prior elections as well. So he's a major figure. He has great name recognition. He's kind of a major star in the Indonesian political firmament. He's a big guy, okay? And so name recognition alone. But the way he got from that 45% to 60% was entirely the coattails of Jokowi. And the fact that basically he is at least visibly seemed very tamed over the past 5 years. He's no longer, the man on horseback or the person stirring up hatreds or claiming election fraud and the like, that he has become this, he was willing to be Jokowi's, kind of a right-hand man. And I think there's a certain relief. So if you look at all those happy people looking on at the sign of them doing the selfie, I think it's an endorsement of the handover. It's an endorsement of the idea, like, if Jokowi says, and Jokowi's immensely popular, like 80%, immensely popular. The fact that Jokowi gave his sanction to Prabowo, and you can look at the polling results from a year ago before he did that, and you see that Ganjar, again, the guy from the main party, he looked like he was going to win. And this is very much about Jokowi getting, it is very much a vote for continuity. So whereas often we say, well, this strong man or this populist or this person was elected because people are so disgusted with democracy and they want to throw everybody out and they want to turn everybody, it's completely not that. It's so completely not that. This is absolutely about people liking the way things are going and thinking, okay. And I think also there was a bit of a rally at the end, because remember the 50% rule, right? If Prabowo had gotten 49%, you've got 4.5 more months of campaigning. And Indonesia, Indonesians, I think, they want to make sure that things stay stable. They may be a little worried that if there's another 4.5 months, people might start making, some appeals that are a little uglier than they have so far. So I do think there was a kind of rally behind the winner effect as well. Both because people like to choose the winner, they don't like to choose the person who's going to lose. And I think some people were like, let's get this over in one round. He's going to win. Let's make sure he gets to get it over in one round, and then we go from there. But it's deeply concerning. And also the young people voted overwhelmingly for Prabowo, and they don't have any living memory of the things he did in the 1990s. And so very unlike what just happened in Pakistan, what just happened in Thailand, where the youth voted overwhelmingly for sort of anti-military, pro-democratic parties, the youth in Indonesia voted for Prabowo. So we can only hope that he will actually, show some restraint, actually realize that the way he stays popular is if he behaves more like Jokowi, which again is in this more low-key, humble, very, very kind of popular touch sort of manner.
Well, I was going to ask you why Jokowi endorsed him, but I think that you explained that. So someone like Jokowi, if he didn't seem interested in putting down the democracy in Indonesia, what is it that makes someone like him want to endorse someone who has such anti-democratic aims?
Right. So let's kind of get inside Jokowi's head a little bit here. So Jokowi cares about basically one thing, okay? He's obsessed with economic development, okay? He wants the country to grow, to prosper, to become a wealthy country. Like, this is what his absolute obsession is, right? And he's spent 10 years, you might know they're building a new national capital, and just projects galore, like infrastructure. And so he's very, very focused on these things. And he genuinely cares very much about people's kind of quality of life and their cost of living and these kinds of things, okay? So he's been doing this for 10 years. And in fact, when it looked like he might try to, wriggle out of term limits and get a third term, his rationale was, well, I lost these 2 years because of COVID. Like, I need 10 years to really help Indonesia. And I think in some way, I think he really meant it. He's not some incredibly power-hungry person, I don't think. But he's concerned with, he has children. He's concerned with the continuity. He feels he's accomplished a lot in 10 years. Indonesian voters agree. He wants to see that continue. So he wants someone who he can rely on to keep this going. And he wants, his sons are getting interested in politics. And like most fathers in this situation, you help them when you can, unfortunately, but this is sort of how things go. And I would say I actually haven't said in some ways the main rationale. So why did Jokowi reach out to him, right? So part of the way to think about this is, who can hurt me still, okay? And so again, Prabowo is someone who he had spent, he was working with people saying, Jokowi's not a real Muslim, right? Some of these kinds, like incredibly inflammatory kind of rhetoric toward Jokowi, right? So in part, it's protection, it's an insurance policy. If I make Prabowo my defense minister, then I don't have to worry so much about him going after me anymore. If I endorse him as president, I'm not worried about, Ganjar is some nice guy who's governor of Central Java. I don't have to worry about him, right? But if this guy, if I don't support him and he wins, could he come after me? Could he undermine my legacies? Could he come after my family? And so to some extent, and I think this is part of, in a lot of parts of the world, this is part of where strongman appeal comes from, honestly. Some of it is, I like the strongman. And sometimes it's like, I'm scared of what this guy's going to do if they lose. I don't trust this person. Like, just let them win, and hopefully they'll be, hopefully the rules and the institutions will constrain them. Again, not a gamble I would ever recommend. But I think that's part of the story there as well. But it's really, you have to understand the obsession with economic development. Jokowi doesn't care about democracy. He does care about pluralism. He doesn't want to see, Islamists who want to go after ethnic minorities. He's been very, very harsh on those types because you're keeping the country from its real mission, which is to prosper, okay? So once you think of him as single-minded in that way, you can kind of start thinking through why he's made the choices he has, which I think are very, very dangerous choices, to be clear.
Regarding the natural resources that Indonesia possesses, they're very resource-rich in coal, nickel, and the palm oil. Do you see them leveraging their position, like in terms of climate politics, climate policies, do you see them being spoken more about in that regard?
Yes. I think the simple answer is yes. Yeah, Indonesia's, again, its natural riches and the fact that they're so vital, these resources for energy transition, green transition in the world economy, really raises Indonesia's profile. The fact that Indonesia is kind of equidistant between the United States and China and wants to maintain strong relations with both also gives them a kind of leeway that they can kind of play this role. But I would also say, you know, and this I think is one of the tragedies of Indonesian politics, not having more competition, not having more opposition. I mean, Indonesia is very, very vulnerable to climate change. I mean, you're talking about, you know, 13,000 plus islands, right? So really, really vulnerable. It's one reason they're moving the capital. You know, I mean, Jakarta is sinking. Jakarta is, so trying to just deal with that. It is, I think, a real pity that there is no environmental party in Indonesia, right? Just to keep these issues on the agenda, because again, when you think about, you know, the past president obsessed with economic development, 80% of the people love him because he's obsessed with economic development. There's not a very strong counter voice calling for, let's make sure we're doing things in an environmentally responsible way. So the politics of environment being kind of a low-key issue is really is concerning as well. But there's no question that Indonesia will try to leverage every resource it has to try to get, you know, what it wants and needs in geopolitical affairs, no question.
What's the status of the media? Is there a tradition of independent journalism? Are there state-controlled organs? And a possibly related question, can you just comment on the unique geography of Indonesia and how that may contribute to the status of democracy there?
Yeah. Media historically, during what we call the Reformasi era, the reform era, very, very, very vibrant, very critical. I wish you all could share the experience of going to an Indonesian press conference where you see what these, absolutely dogged defenders of the public interest. Very, very, very attentive to concerns with corruption in particular. The media can be very, very, really, really vibrant in that way too. But their space is shrinking. And this is true everywhere. I mean, this is, again, far from an Indonesia story. Journalists everywhere are threatened. Journalists everywhere are under fire across the world. It's just one of the biggest problems for democracy we have right now. Again, elections are great, and we should have elections, and I'm glad we have elections, and they're a vital part of democracy. But a free, non-intimidated press is every bit as important to the health of a democracy. And that's what all over the world is coming under attack. So that media still exists, but then the question is, are they breaking through? Do they, even when they are able to be critical and they're not being intimidated or they're not being, charged with crimes as they have been in recent years, are they getting the ears? Are they getting the eyes of young Indonesians who have been, like young Americans, been sucked into the vortex of kind of a social media and, very, TikTok style, short, sweet, feed your lizard brain with content kind of interaction with media. That's a global problem. So is there the demand there for that kind of journalism? So those brave journalists are there. Whether or not they're going to still have, they're going to have less space with Prabowo. That will definitely get worse. I don't think there's any way there's any question about that. But this is something that's more on the front edge of things that have already been eroding and getting worse. And I suspect, again, with Prabowo, that it's something we should be watching because, again, Indonesia is an important diplomatic partner. And I do think that we, as we do with India, as we do with Turkey, as we do with Mexico, as we do with Brazil, that we're keeping these issues on the agenda, and that we're calling attention to the situation with journalists and people, all kinds of critical speech when we're interacting with these countries globally. So I can't overstate how important your question is and how vital this question of media is all over the world.
Thank you, Dr. Slater, for your talk and for the information you've given us about Prabowo tonight. Yeah. One thing you've mentioned a lot so far is that a lot of what got Prabowo elected was having the endorsement from Jokowi, and that, I guess in essence, Jokowi has left Indonesia in a really good place at the moment. I'm not an expert in Indonesia, so correct me if I'm mistaken in my facts and I'm misremembering. But I'm thinking back to the Suharto regime, and that a lot of what helped him initially last for so long was that he oversaw a lot of development that was generally well perceived by the Indonesian public. So my question to you is, let's say worst case scenario, we start to see Prabowo start to slide back into those tendencies that he had previously under the Suharto regime.
Yeah.
Do you see, well, let me take it back. Do you anticipate that there will be a pushback from the Indonesian population? Or is there a risk that if he moves slowly with what he's doing, the Indonesian population might in turn look away and kind of let that slide a bit, as we saw during the Suharto years?
Yeah. No, great question. So I'll give you one example here. So when Jokowi was reelected in 2019, and again, civil society, people who believe in pluralism, people who wanted to sustain democracy, I mean, they rallied. They rallied like mad to defeat Prabowo back in both 2014 and 2019. And Jokowi really betrayed them almost immediately by kind of sort of ramrodding through this omnibus bill, this very, very complicated piece of legislation, which included some things like you can't insult the president, and did include some real restrictions on civil society. And Indonesian, so you go back and look. You can say, oh, go Google omnibus bill Jakarta protests or something like that, and you'll see what I'm talking about. They came out in droves to oppose this, and that made him kind of roll it back. And then they've kind of slow walked a lot of the features in this omnibus bill over time. There's no question that Indonesian civil society will fight, that there are plenty of people in civil, again, if nobody else, the youth, the students will be out, and the students will see it as their mission to prevent the erosion of democracy. So there will be fight. The problem is that, as with the sort of slow walk in the omnibus bill, that since then there's been this increased criminalization of that kind of upsurge. So when Jokowi did this in 2019, there was this big eruption. It's not clear if in 2024, if something similar is attempted, that people will be able to accomplish the same thing because of repression, because of different kinds of intimidation. The prospect, you're gonna lose your job, you're gonna get kicked out of university, you're gonna be, like, these things will happen to you if you join these protests. So Indonesia, as a function of its authoritarian period, has a very, very powerful security state. So the police, the military, the intelligence services. And you might remember in the early 2000s, there was this spate of Islamist bombings. Like there was bombing in Bali, there were bombings in Jakarta. It was basically the reason Indonesia was in the news, right? It's always something bad in Indonesia if it's in the news, right? If it's not in the news, like, things might be okay. But there was this real, it really was this, there was a pretty strong out branch of Al-Qaeda that was operating in Indonesia. And the Indonesian security services clamped this down. Like, they're very, very good at their jobs. Unfortunately, that also means they can turn their expertise and their talents against democratic opposition. So it will be a fight. And my worry is that the scales have already tipped, that the erosion's already taken place, that, again, that kind of defeatism I talked about, a lot of that defeatism I'm worried about is within Indonesian civil society, who say Jokowi's already completely destroyed democracy, right? That is something you will absolutely hear when you talk to Indonesian youth and Indonesian protesters. And so if that's the case, are they gonna say, well, what am I fighting to protect at this point? Like, is it already gone? Is it already too far gone? So I worry about the kind of defeatism. I worry about complacency on, like, outside observers, and I worry about defeatism within. So, but there are plenty of people who won't take it lying down, I assure you.
You were talking about Indonesia's historic, robust anti-corruption commission, but you used the word limping along. Are they trying to fortify that? Are they trying to maybe get younger people involved in getting that back to to its proud history? Because it sounds like with this guy in office, and and it's limping along. That's not a great combination.
It is definitely not a great combination. So the KPK, again, if you're interested in these things, I would encourage you just to Google it, read about it. You'll be amazed. Most developing countries, middle-income countries in the world, people would kill to have an anti-corruption commission like this. I mean, they've spent 20 years, they get real people. Like, they absolutely will catch, and they will imprison, they will try and have imprisoned some very, very important political and economic figures in Indonesia. This is a anti-corruption commission with real teeth, okay? And that's where it got into some trouble, okay? Because if it's effective, then people might not be so happy. So the usual, you can probably imagine, the rhetorical attack on the KPK, you can imagine this, right? People say, oh, the KPK is not doing, it's a total failure. It's a total failure. So these politicians would say, we have to get rid of it, it's total failure. Why is it a total failure? Because they keep arresting corrupt people. They're not eradicating corruption at all. Like, look, they've been around for decades, and they're clearly not eradicating corruption. Exactly. You're supposed to laugh, right? They don't say it to get a laugh, but it should get a laugh, because that's how ridiculous it is. But so they are trying, again, people in civil society, journalists, lawyers, lots of people are trying very hard to help the KPK get back its strengths. The problem is that the political elite doesn't want it to be strengthened, at least for the most part. So at one point, when they really started running afoul, they started getting into corruption within the police. And the president at the time, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, said, this is like, when the KPK goes after the police, it's like a gecko attacking a crocodile. And so, in a sense, what's happened is we've seen that, again, very effective, and so there's been this kind of rollback in its independence, and so appointing of its governors, and then using anti-corruption accusations against people within the KPK as a way of undermining them, all this kind of stuff. So yes, people are fighting back, people are pushing back, but the crocodile is, at this point, stronger than the gecko. And so that's gonna take, it's gonna really take something pretty major to get that going back in the right direction. But again, it does exist. The KPK is still there. It isn't gone. We shouldn't think, if they eliminated it tomorrow, it would mean a lot. So even though it's weakened, we should still see this as really vital that it be preserved in even its current form, so that there's some chance, again, under a future leadership, under rejuvenated civil society, it could gain its teeth back again. So.
We've got a text question, and this person is asking if you could comment on the role of ethnic Chinese today, and if there are any differences in attitudes towards mainland China versus Taiwanese.
So in terms of the fate of ethnic Chinese, so this I think is this is an important story. So when the Suharto regime was in its death throes, when it was collapsing, it turned in a very, very rancid, evil, violent, murderous way against its ethnic Chinese minority. So in many parts of Southeast Asia, there are small but relatively well-off ethnic Chinese minorities. This should resonate with stories all around the world where there are ethnic groups that get scapegoated for their relative wealth. This is not to say that most Chinese are wealthy. They are not. But again, among the richest people in a country like Indonesia or Malaysia are disproportionately Chinese. So therefore, they're a ready-made scapegoat. It wasn't democratization that endangered the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. It was a decaying, dying dictatorship. And in particular, the son-in-law of the dictator, Prabowo Subianto, who was again leading the charge, and again, some of you can Google, Jakarta, May 1998, rapes Chinese women. It's horrible. But this was this real attack that this dying regime used against a vulnerable ethnic Chinese minority as a way of trying to hang on to power. I don't think there's any question, if we take, again, a 25-year picture, has the situation gotten better for ethnic Chinese in Indonesia under democracy than it was under dictatorship? I think it's an absolute yes. It's an absolute yes. It doesn't mean that there are never hate crimes. It doesn't mean that there's no discrimination. It doesn't mean that local governments don't come up with laws that will make people feel discriminated against. It's not a role model for the world, right? There's a lot of intolerance that makes through to government policy. but it is of really, really different magnitude than what came before. Again, part of when things got very ugly and polarized around 2016, 2017, it's because the governor of Jakarta, so Jakarta is the capital, but it's also a state or province. So there's a governor, and the governor was ethnic Chinese. And the governor of Jakarta, who went by the name, who's known as Ahok, Ahok was accused of insulting the Quran and led to these massive protests. And it really did look fearful for a time that some of these most hateful Islamist groups in Indonesia were going to really turn against the Chinese minority. And that's where, again, Jokowi and the state really stood up to defend them. And they banned, not in the most legally meticulous way possible, but they banned these kind of extremist, violent, essentially gangster Islamist organizations that, imagine, again, you run a restaurant and a bunch of Islamists come to your door and they say, we think you have bad morals, you should be paying us money every month to stay open, right? It's that kind of thing. So nasty, nasty bunch of folks. And so they did a pretty good job of cracking down on them. Again, those people who believe in law would like to have seen it being done in a slightly more legal way and less of a security state kind of way. But you are, I think, to a large degree protected. And again, I think it's been Indonesian democracy, broadly speaking, has been a story where majority rule has not meant a worse fate for minorities in general, broadly speaking. And then in terms of what that relates to China, it does allow, I think, for some, there have been times when leaders have been accused of being too close to China, and that's it's sort of a dog whistle. It's a little bit of a code for being, insufficiently Islamic. But again, that's not really a big part of the discussion right now. The campaign didn't really feature those kinds of things. 2024 was a much, much more unpolarized kind of campaign than the prior ones, which in some ways is very good. In some ways it's very good, to be sure, despite the result of it, so.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really informative. There's one piece, though, that I'm still unclear on. You talked about Prabowo's incoming vice president. He's very young, 36, questionable style, maybe. That denim jacket was a little interesting.
Doesn't ring vice presidential exactly. Acid washed,
Right, this kind of thing.
Right.
The judge that made the exception that he could even be on the ballot. These kinds of things. Is there anything there to recommend him? Though, what is his profile? I heard you say that Prabowo really got this youth vote, right? Which was kind of interesting, seeing that a lot of them, don't know his politics or were we. So was this incoming vice president, was he kind of the key to that? Does he have any potential, anything to offer Indonesia, or is he really just young with bad style? I don't know.
I don't think he has anything to offer. No, fundamentally, so again, the vice presidency is weak. It's not a position with generally what presidential candidates in Indonesia will choose someone who, literally to get balance. This is kind of a tradition in American politics too, right? We say we want someone from the West or from the East or from, you want a kind of a diverse ticket for a diverse country. So, and this has its roots in the fact that the two founding fathers of Indonesia, one was Javanese and one was from outer islands, was non-Javanese. So this idea that a country that's, a majority Javanese, but then there's huge minorities all around, you want to have some kind of balance. So usually you pick a vice president to send a signal about who you want to kind of include. This is basically an insurance policy. This is just sort of, and this was just a way of making it clear from Jokowi that this ticket that Prabowo had his backing. He never formally endorsed him, right? But this was a way of sort of signaling that. He's essentially, he's an empty acid-washed jacket, right? He's just basically, he's a young kid he's not gonna have any real role at all. He is there as a sign of the arranged marriage, effectively, right? And so if he does become a very talented politician, it will be something new, and that could happen. He could certainly rise, as with any 36-year-old, you could become great. I won't write him off, but there's nothing that he's done. He's been mayor of Surakarta or Solo, the same city that his father was mayor of. He's been mayor for a brief period of time. Again, the process of how they put him there is the story. He is not the story. The role he is going to play is not the story. And in some ways, it's such a waste, because to kind of, to make these unethical moves as a way of anointing someone as vice president, and to bend these rules and whatever for a kind of a not powerful position anyway, and to no really great effect, it's just a real waste. It's just a real shame that, in all the other ways that Jokowi's record as a Democrat is going to be a checkered one, it really kind of compounds that in ways that are, I think, just unfortunate and really quite meaningless, to be honest.
Let's thank Dan Slater again for.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Lots of information. I hope you were intrigued by that. Join us next week when Haraki Marathi Gottlieb is coming from Pace University in New York, and she was instrumental in working on the UN High Seas Treaty. She's an international lawyer. And talking about the high seas as our global commons, we should be able to all transport ourselves along high seas. As we know, it's become a little bit of an issue in our world, and she's going to lead us through a conversation about that. That's right here next week, same time. Thanks again to the Ford Museum. Thank you to the Ford Foundation. Thank you to Wolverine Worldwide and WGVU Public Media for making this all happen. Appreciate it. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.